Debate is one of the many glues that hold civilized societies together. And if we cease to have debate, all we have is a bunch of slogans and a bunch of half-pregnant words that we throw at people and impose them. The big example of this, I mean, the Greeks thought that the way in which politicians live is important because they model. People look at what they do and emulate them. And when we have somebody who simply comes out and say, I'm not going to talk to you, and you're not worthy of dialogue because you're evil, because you're this and this and this, is essentially setting up a system or a kind of culture in which we can no longer be civilized, because what it means to be civilized is to engage each other in dispute, is to engage one another in disagreement.
Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and a Calgary professor, Frances Widdowson, was fired in early January for daring to ask questions about BLM and daring to espouse within an academic setting that there were indeed some merits despite the overwhelming negativity of the residential school systems. These types of tough conversations were once an expectation within academic circles. Professors were supposed to raise challenging questions, debate them. The best ideas were set to prevail and the weaker ideas would fall away. That's how universities once worked. But those days are gone and forgotten. Universities now more than anything else simply echo progressive talking points. And if you step out of line with that dogma, you find yourself on the outs. That's exactly what happened to Frances Widdowson, but it isn't an isolated experience. It's happening to more and more people. Joining me to discuss this is former Mount Royal University professor and president of the Haultain Research Institute, Marco Navarro-Génie. Well, Marco, I want to thank you so much for joining me for this interview. There's definitely been a bit of a troubling trend, I'd say, generally within academics. There was a time when universities were a place where divergent ideas would intersect, and maybe in a sort of competitive open market way, the best ideas would come out and win. That's clearly not the case within academia anymore, and this is sort of capitulated in the story of Frances Widdowson at Mount Royal University. I think it extends far beyond her story, though, but maybe for folks out there, you were a colleague of Frances Widdowson's. If you could let people know, for those who aren't familiar with the story, just kind of a rough recap of what happened.
I taught at Mount Royal between 1993 and 2013. So I would have crossed paths with Frances for 4 or 5 years. Frances is a controversial researcher, shall we say. She's a pretty terrific teacher. Her students at the time respected her a great deal. I know many of them. The issue with her, though, was that she had built or started to build a career questioning what essentially is the sacred cow of Aboriginal affairs in Canada. Now, she was hired with people knowing that this was her field of work and that her views were controversial. She was then promoted several years later on account of the books that she was publishing and books that were fairly well received among people who would like to question things and real scholars. Mm-hmm. Controversial to say the least, but nonetheless. And then suddenly, and perhaps not so suddenly because these things started to build, she claims around 2015, things turned the corner somehow. It's probably a coincidence that is also the year in which our current prime minister came into office, but I am not making any connections about that. But it has something to do with the woke ideology. And so the two are connected in that sense. But the short and the long of it is people began to complain more vociferously about her work as the culture turned towards this idea that universities should be indigenized, which she resisted. And then people started different petitions, some by faculty, some by students, By all accounts, I've heard that about 6,000 signatures were gathered in petitions to get her dismissed. But even if it had been 100,000 signatures, it doesn't really matter. She's a tenured professor, or used to be. And the whole point of tenure is to be able to defend scholars who say controversial things, who say things that are running against the grain of the culture, because the whole point of a university is the pursuit of truth.
And that's exactly the shocking thing. This seems like one of the places where you should be able to have these conversations. Almost like academia and comedy are places you can voice maybe unpopular opinions, at least within a respectful academic setting, so that those ideas can be discussed and explored. The shocking thing with this, though, is Frances Widdowson is hardly a right-wing conservative stalwart. She'd be considered by many a progressive or a left-wing person who just has on indigenous issues with like books like Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry. She has concerns about how these people are not being treated quite fairly, and it's because of some of the talking points that are circulating, particularly among progressives. So we're talking about someone who very much, other than this one talking point, is one of their people, not an outsider, not a conservative outsider. And we're talking about someone who is, I think, on a fundamental, expressing a concern for these people and how they've been treated in maybe a different way. But regardless, she's been very much canceled. When did this shift take place? When did they start going after their own?
It's interesting. Yes, as you say, she defines herself as a historical materialist, which is a different way of saying a Marxist. And there are lots of people in the academy who are socialist, who are this and that and the other thing, but very few will have the intellectual gumption to declare themselves a Marxist. And so in many ways, she's pegged herself on the left, and you could argue on the far left by most accounts. But it's got nothing to do with that. It's got something to do with the haphazard of postmodernity. This whole woke ideology is got absolutely nothing with rationalistic principles, but is very emotivistic. And this is one of the things that she constantly called out. Her first book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, for example, wasn't so much critical of Aboriginals, but was critical of Aboriginal policy and the people she defined as being the supposed defenders of Aboriginals, who were in a class of their own and who were benefiting the most from this sort of industry. The lawyers, the consultants, and many of the chiefs themselves. She was trying to defend what you would argue is the little guy in Aboriginal reserves, right? You would think that the culture in general, Canadians would want to uphold that. And but something clicked, something changed. And she started opposing, for example, haphazard things like Black Lives Matter. She started opposing things like the whole culture of giving preferential treatment to certain people because of their sexual preferences or because of the color of their skin. And what she was trying to argue is that this is essentially not just a haphazard culture, but it's a culture that runs against the grain of what being a university is about. Frances, for all her sometimes abrasive ways, and she can be, she is a defender of the principles of a university, and she's being sacrificed for that.
Well, it's interesting that someone who sort of a self-professed Marxist would once again be railing against a new sort of class structure, this Aboriginal industry, this progressive tier of society that is not allowed to be questioned. But I wanted to get a little bit beyond just her experience, because obviously her story is one that's garnered a lot of attention. There are other people like Dr. Jordan Peterson who've gone through similar experiences. Dr. Julie Ponesse, obviously, with the Democracy Fund. You had something of a similar experience yourself as well, did you not?
Yes. The context of this is quite wide. I remember, for example, one of the largest figures in political science scholarship, he's passed away now, a man named Kenneth Minogue, came to the University of Calgary This is almost 30 years ago. And Minogue was from New Zealand. So he came to talk about the progress that the Maori had made in dealings with the New Zealand government, which inspired some people to think that they were going to commit genocide against the Maori, that they were going to assimilate them and whatnot. And the organizers could not have the talk on campus at the university. This is 30 years ago nearly. But the talk ended up being in one of the glass towers in Calgary. Somebody loaned their boardroom. So the contrast is you couldn't have these conversations in the ivory tower, and now you'd have to hold them in the glass towers downtown, which is quite the contrast. The point is universities were created in order to have spaces in which people could conduct free thinking, free debate, free discussion, away from the marketplace. What the Greeks called the agora. And so now it's entirely the opposite. You can have these conversations in the marketplace, but the last place where you can have these kinds of conversations and question things are universities. And so there is a long list of real scholars who keep questioning things. You mentioned Peterson, you mentioned Julie, and on it goes. When I was in university, this madness of social justice had just begun. And so it is this madness of social justice imposes a certain layer of uniformity on the thinking. It is, as Widdowson points out, a kind of totalitarianism in the name of variety, in the name of justice. And so a couple of colleagues of mine, when I was teaching, ran into these sorts of problems. And coincidentally, my other colleague was a bit of a Marxist as well. So, and we were good friends because we believed in the mandate of the university, which is to question and to teach a robust culture of debate. But eventually, what this sort of setup does is that people who have access to grind against someone cannot wait for you to trip one of the wires of social justice, to run against the grain and unleash the machinery that is already created to declare you basically an undesirable according to the. So sometimes it doesn't really have to engage the culture of social justice or the opposite. It's simply being weaponized in many cases. And that was the case, I think, in my own personal situation.
It's interesting that you say that it was 30 years ago in academia, very much, whether people like to admit it or not, and maybe to a lesser extent. But what starts in academic circles often then ends up in the marketplace and starts spreading. So I think this very much did spread and start from academics. At the time, possibly a few fringe academics who are very pushy, but now the mainstream and every other idea has been pushed out. To what extent do you see the progressivism and the lack of capacity to dialogue in society as a result of that shift that started so many years ago within academia?
When I was a grad student at the University of Calgary, we took a course. I took a course in political ideas. That was kind of my major. And one of the things that we had discussed was this sort of marriage between Marxism and postmodernity. These Nietzsche and Marx sort of bound up together in this fellow named Foucault. But the idea here is that nothing is really true, right? That it's all about perspectives. And one of the things that becomes really apparent when nothing is really true is that in order to assert a truth, you then have to use some kind of compulsion or some kind of force. It basically means that you're giving up the notion that you can open up a space in which things can be discussed and get at some kind of truth. But if there is no truth, then the extension of that idea is that there is only force. And, we see it in what just took place in Ottawa, for example. Is the imposition of one discourse over another. And when you cannot do that, then you have to resort to force and to violence. In the case of university administrators. They don't have to resort to violence in the sense of punching somebody in the face, but they have all the power. And so they have become the guardians of this culture in which no truth can be professed, but the single ideology that variety is our strength. We should cringe when we hear that, because the people who profess to stand on the side of variety are essentially saying that unless you agree with them, you're out in one way or another. This is the case of social justice, for example, right? Variety is our strength. We should be on the side of the poor. We should be on the side of this and that. But the moment you start to question it, then you're pretty much done for. That's not what universities are supposed to be. So this larger context essentially is, as you point out, a spillover of arguments that began in universities among a group of scholars who we now identify as postmodern, and then spilled into the culture. Spilled into the culture, not necessarily, out of their ear, but they've taught an entire generation of students this kind of nonsense, which, of course, many believed and many were taught to embrace uncritically.
Now, finally, with what we've seen over the past 2 years, and then I think extending beyond that with the social justice sort of unquestioning uniformity we all must embrace, that it was not the academics who stepped up. It wasn't even the doctors. Largely, it wasn't the media. It wasn't the civil liberties unions. It was the truckers standing up for fundamental freedoms. It was working class blue collar people. Has some of that common sense sensibility or all of it vacated academia? And is there a hope that, or are there emerging voices? I mean, we can talk about Jordan Peterson, Julie Ponesse, but is there a hope that there might be a resurgence of the sort of great academics challenging and questioning and dialoguing?
Two things out of that. One is that there are people in the academy still who are worth their salt, who are questioning things, and who, for the most part, try to keep their head down and do their work. Because if they gain any kind of notoriety like Frances, then the establishment comes down on them and writes petitions and does all this stuff. So this is not to say, so the indictment that I would like to issue against the academy is more against the administrators than most of the faculty, even though there is a good cohort of, I would call them lunatics in the academy that profess this kind of belief. The second issue is, and they're connected, is the fact that the culture and the regular media has been putting down the truckers because they're blue collar, because they don't have university degrees, because they haven't taken courses in constitutional politics, and they thought that petitioning the governor general would change things and stuff like that, which seems kind of naive, but let's not miss the intent of what they're trying to ask, right? It does not get lost on me that a great deal of these folks embrace the kind of common sense which they do. They know they're being oppressed, and they can voice it, and they can voice it in viva voce, because they haven't bought into this whole postmodern construct of reality. In other words, they are voicing their opinions freely, almost precisely because they didn't go to university, almost precisely because they are not part of this bubble of color and meaning and understanding that has nearly created a separate reality. And so the extent to which we see classes here, some people have said, is a gap between the rural and the urban. There is flavor, there is that kind of flavor, but really there is a kind of a class struggle here that has opened up between the people who can stay home and work and continue to receive the benefits in this sort of new COVID regime, and the people who risked their lives, if this thing had been as lethal as we originally thought, they risked their lives getting out there. They're the taxi drivers, they're the bus drivers, they're the truck drivers, they're the attendants at the grocery store. Those are the people whose lives have been dramatically affected because their businesses and their places of work were shut down, and they could not essentially carry on living. I mean, we'd like to think that $2,000 a month is a lot of money, but it's not. You can't live on $2,000 a month. Most people can't, especially if you have all kinds of commitments and whatnot. So the CERB money that was supposed to placate people is not what it was supposed to be. But the second thing is that this is going on for months and months and months. Mm-hmm. The 2 weeks has now become 2 years, and people are fed up considering that their lives have been upended. The last part, I could go on for a long time about this, but the last part about this, of course, has been the vaccination exemptions. The idea that we can marginalize people for making a choice about their own health, and the fact that we have an irresponsible man in power, the prime minister, who has come out and actively deride them, mock them, demonize them, and this is what you get. This is a kind of pushback. We can debate whether it has merit or not. We can debate whether it's right or not. But the reality is, if we want to examine root causes, as the prime minister is often fond of wanting to do, he is largely the root cause of what took place in Ottawa.
And I think what you said there is so important, and it's what they don't want. It's what they didn't want with Frances Widdowson. It's what they don't want from these truckers. Justin Trudeau wants to end that debate. Academics are following in that track, and quite possibly they've set up that sort of narrative that debate is to be silenced. Well, in a functioning society, debate can't be silenced. It has to be allowed, even if those ideas are unpopular. You disagreed, surely, with Frances Widdowson, as I'm sure I would, on a number of issues, but we would, I think, agree. We'd probably disagree with each other on a number of issues, but I think we agree that it's important that we're all afforded that freedom to have our voices heard, particularly in academia. We could go on forever. I very much appreciate your insight. Any final remarks before we wrap up?
Debate is one of the many glues that hold civilized societies together. And if we cease to have debate, all we have is a bunch of slogans and a bunch of half-pregnant words that we throw at people and impose them. The big example of this, the Greeks thought that the way in which politicians live is important because they model. People look at what they do and emulate them. And when we have somebody who simply comes out and say, I'm not going to talk to you, and you're not worthy of dialogue because you're evil, because you're this and this and this, is essentially setting up a system or a kind of culture in which we can no longer be civilized, because what it means to be civilized is to engage each other in dispute, is to engage one another in disagreement. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have that, and we cannot create that space, we cannot make the effort. Look, the prime minister's job is to talk to people. When he says that he's not going to talk to these people, he's essentially giving up his job. He's not doing his job. So once that kind of attitude penetrates the culture widely, it is significantly difficult to have politics. Mm-hmm. And if you cannot have politics, you essentially descend in a kind of place in which you're opening up discord to exaggeration, and exaggeration to violence, and violence to the rest of things that essentially robs us of what it means to be civilized.
And it's sad with some of this political leadership that we have seen in Canada to see society coming to this, to see the universities coming to this. Marco, thank you so much for joining me. I hope we can continue this conversation. And for everyone out there, hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. It is not simply academics and universities that have been plagued by unilateral one-track mindedness. Unfortunately, the state-funded mainstream media is also pushing one narrative even when the facts don't align with it. Well, here at Rebel News, we ask the questions that those other outlets simply will not, and we tell the stories. We tell the other side of the story like no one else can. If you want to support our independent journalism, you can do so by going to rebelnews.com and subscribing to Rebel News Plus.